yields were extremely low in ancient times. There are occasional periods of abundance when people could store large amounts of food. And in those cases, the facility for storage was of critical importance. The number of jars you had was a measure of wealth in ancient Bangladesh. In the biblical stories, even though they weren't intended to be historical narratives, you get hints of the agriculture. For instance, the story of Gideon's army is the story of a population which harvested moderate amounts, but at the time of the harvest they were invaded by the Midianites. And therefore what they did was store their food in jars and hide them in the mountains. And then the Midianites would come and gather what they could find and then leave. And the story of Gideon's army is the organization of a resistance against the invaders. The story of Joseph in the Bible is another kind, where there were 7 years of very good harvests that they stored. And these were put aside for 7 years of poor harvests. And when there were poor harvests, not only did they eat them, eat the good harvests, but they shared with peoples from the whole region. And in the book of Genesis, you get the accounts of migrants coming from other parts of the Middle East to Egypt. Like Abraham coming from Mesopotamia, from the city of Ur, and moving through the middle of the East. You learn a little of their agriculture too, from the fact that they had goats and cattle, goats and sheep rather, mostly. And in the story of Laban, you get the first hint that there's the danger of overpopulation. And so there's a negotiation between Laban and Abraham dividing the land so that there'd be enough grazing for their animals. Climate kept changing also in the Middle East. There'd be periods of drought and dust, and there'd be periods of greater abundance. So the word tel in the Middle East is a mound where there was development of housing, and then it was buried by dust. And then people would come by and develop another mound. And so you have one over another, forming records of different civilizations. And the most famous one is Tel Aviv, which again was a mound that had been covered at times and built up at other times. So it's important to recognize that peoples were always changing. Now, because of nationalist reasons, it's common to say our people lived here and toiled the soil for millennia. Almost everywhere, that's a lie. First of all, people never did the same thing for millennia. They're adopting new crops, new methods. Populations are different. Secondly, people never were in the same place for millennia. And pretty much every people has a story of their getting there from somewhere else. Along with their getting there from somewhere else, there'll be accounts of acquiring of the technology, sometimes in the form of a god, like Prometheus giving them fire. And the Navajo has first woman providing them with the corn. So it's important to know that people's accounts are the way in which they understand their past, not the way the past actually was. An analysis of the book of Genesis is also interesting in that regard. There's a lot of internal evidence to the effect that Abraham and his people came into the region from the north, from Mesopotamia and the rivers. with their sheep and goats, that Jacob and his people came from the south, from the Negev. And it was Joshua who organized the confederation of tribes. And these were people who broke away from the very severe monarchies of Canaan along the coast, the flatlands, and established a kind of confederation which was not ruled by kings. And so for about 200 or 250 years, you had a kind of loose democracy similar to the indigenous peoples of Latin America. Later on, they got into trouble. Later on, the Philistines landed. These were sea peoples from the Aegean, of Greek origin. They attempted to conquer the Egyptians and failed. So the Egyptians put them to work conquering southern Palestine, the area that's now Gaza. And the cities of Eglon and Gaza and several others I forget were the original settlements of the Philistines, who occupied the coast, while the Hebrews occupied the mountains. And what made it possible for them to occupy the mountains was the development of quicklime. They were able to build cisterns and lime the walls so that it could hold water throughout the year, and therefore they could have agriculture throughout the year independent of Canaan. And so this period operated for about 200 or 250 years. They defended themselves by blowing on a shell and gathering together. And then the various clans would provide troops. And sometimes they didn't. And sometimes you get stories in the Bible of complaining that the Ephraimites did not come to the help of the Benjaminites. But this was a confederation of tribes up to about 250 years. Then they changed. And the change was brought about by the Philistines, who had iron chariots and were therefore able to enter the valleys of Jezreel and others, and enter what was previously the safe territory of the Israelites. In order to confront the Philistines, the tribes began to ask for a leader, a sort of king. The book of Samuel talks about how the priest resisted the idea of appointing a king, and God is quoted as being opposed to the idea. Nevertheless, they insisted, and Saul was appointed a king. He wasn't a real king. He didn't have a palace. He didn't have a court. He was simply a war chief. Even though he's referred to as a king, he was a war chief leading the troops to encounters with the Philistines. And this lasted for about a generation. Then the next stage is David coming along, and with David and Solomon, you have the establishment of a monarchy similar to the monarchies of the rest of Palestine. We'll touch on this a little bit later when we deal with anthropological ecology. The important thing here is that human history changes, that there's nothing that we did forever, that we haven't been in the same place forever, and that we very often invent stories to account for how we got there, for how we got our tools, for what our relations are with some of the others. Okay, now, besides being a social organism, having different kinds of societies, we're also biological organisms. And there are features of our biology that are going to be important. First of all, we're animals. And this means that we have to acquire our protein from something else, either from plants directly or indirectly by eating animals. Secondly, we're medium-sized animals. Now, a medium-sized animal needs a lot of food, but it doesn't need as much as a small animal, relatively. So, for instance, rodents have to eat several times their size in a day. We eat about 1 or 2% of our weight per day. It's because we're large, which means that we're losing heat through our body surface, but we're producing heat through our body volume. And the larger the animal, the greater the volume compared to the surface. So because we're mammals, we maintain a relatively high body weight, metabolic rate, as compared to, say, reptiles. A crocodile can get along eating once a week or so. They digest very slowly because their body temperature is low. The same is true of the large snakes or of the big iguanas, where small iguanas, small lizards, have to be carnivores because they have to be able to catch food and eat it quickly. Large ones, when you get up to the cyclurans like this, they can eat grass, and then what they'll do is go off somewhere and digest. There's enough grass for the temperature of the grass in their gut to build up. And so the larger reptiles have a somewhat different kind of metabolism. Of course, crocodiles are meat eaters anyway. There's a big argument about dinosaurs. Were dinosaurs meat eaters or vegetarians? One way of judging this is by the teeth. Whether the teeth are for grinding and chopping, or even whether the teeth are uniform. For instance, a crocodile's teeth are essentially uniform. Dinosaurs have some variation in their teeth, particularly some of them have variable teeth. And the variable teeth suggest that they have to make use of their food intake quickly. They'll chop, they'll grind, they'll pierce. And so the suggestion is that some of the dinosaurs maintained their body temperature. They were on the way to being birds. Actually, birds are more related to the dinosaurs than we are. So by looking at the anatomy of organisms, we begin to get inferences as to what they ate, what kind of way of life. By looking at the feet, you could tell whether these were animals that galumphed around or ran. And the present studies of ancient human feet suggest that our feet were evolved for relatively prolonged long-distance running. That is, for running down prey. And this is different from the cats, where tigers and lions, particularly tigers, leap on their prey, and they have to get it in essentially one leap, or else it's gone. So the anatomy of the organism is giving you information as to what its way of life was. The layers of large predators will also tell you what their prey were. In the studying of ancient people, we find these encampments, and we'll find not only human bones, but animal bones. So you get hints as to what kinds of animals they ate. Now, hunting and gathering was not the grade B movie that's fantasized, where men go forth hunting with spears and engage in hand-to-hand combat with mammoths. Much of the gathering was women sneaking behind trees and clobbering a rodent on the head. Gathering was not this heroism for the most part. There were places where it was true, special hunting, for instance, the fishing off the northwest coast of North America, where they had these long canoes and sophisticated fishing equipment, and they'd bring back lots of fish and have a grand party. It's important to know also that ancient peoples shared their food. There are a lot of mythologies which talk about how the good hunters got the food and therefore got the women. And this is mostly the adolescent fantasies of some of our colleagues at Harvard. But in fact, hunting evolved from catching small animals to surrounding big ones. Like the buffalo hunt involved surrounding animals and then stampeding them. The great annual hunt among the Mongols involved the hunters of the tribe forming a surround, encircling the animals, closing in, killing the animals, enough animals that they thought they would need for the year, and then opening up the surround in the direction of good grazing land. So it's clear that at the time of Genghis Khan, the Mongols had a sense of conservation, of hunting only as much as they needed. Okay, now I've given you some of an introduction of some of the issues in ecology. I did this instead of starting out with introducing each other, mostly because during the first day or so people are shopping and it's not clear which courses they're going to take. By the next session, we'll begin to organize the course. We'll introduce who you are, find out what your majors are, where you came from, and we'll start organizing study groups. Because at the end of the course, there'll be groups of 3 or 4 students who will give a collective report on some ecological topic. I have the syllabus here. Syllabuses are usually turned in at the last minute on the urging of the education office, which means that we don't always stick to them. My office is room 1219. Because of my health problems, I'll only be there for a short time after class, and we can make appointments. Are there any questions about any of this? Okay, so you've taken your first step toward being ecologists. And most of you are taking other courses that have nothing to do with ecology. When you take those courses, what I urge you to do is to always ask the question, okay, but where does the rest of the world enter? Because most of the stories that you're getting are dealing with people. And the environments of people are taken as given. So you should be asking the question, what happens when climate changes? What happens when people come from somewhere else? What happens when they invent new ways of harvesting food? There's always the question, how does the rest of the world enter? And it's through that we're going to be entering into the broader questions of the nature of complexity and complex ecosystems. Because if ecology is nothing else, it's a science of complexity. Whereas some of the molecular courses tend to focus on single molecules. Here we're dealing with associations of species, what determines the numbers of species that coexist, what determines their relationship with each other, and therefore how does disease appear. In the second week, we're going to be studying the origins of infectious disease and the relation between infectious disease and the rest of nature, the animals they come from. Friends, why do a lot of infectious diseases come from the Middle East? Why did so very few come from North America? What happens to a population that hasn't met a disease before? How do populations develop resistance? So these will all be questions of ecology, of how our species is relating to the other species in the habitats that we exist in. Okay, that's it for now. I have some syllabuses.